Right? When we think about building a city, we usually think about building a city with, physically, right? And if you can imagine your forefathers in Singapore or from wherever you come from, maybe 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, how did they build their city? How did they build their life and living and success? They built it with their hands. And I'd like to ask you, when was the last time you did something like this? I can't remember, right? Maybe I did some stuff as a child, but when were we actually building something with our hands? And we all know that we're living in a world now when it's no longer about building things as much as building and creating things in our minds, right? In our heads rather than our hands. And so, especially in Singapore, we're moving towards this era where we are increasingly moving away from building things with our hands into building and creating things with ideas. If you just look back from the 1960s, during my father's time, what were we doing in Singapore? We were building, or making rather, toys, T-shirts, and exporting them to the world. We moved from toys, T-shirts into TVs. Sony, Hitachi came to Singapore to manufacture these electronics, and now into high tech. And innovation looks like this. I mean, this is how we built our wealth, our success. And it kind of seems to be sort of very paced and very logical. And I was thinking, what is the challenge of today, for us today? Because that was innovation maybe in the last century, but what does innovation look like today? And it looks more like this. How many of us had seen Facebook coming, or Twitter coming, or even Google coming? There's an inherent unpredictability and uncertainty in innovation and in how to capture and how to build and create things of value today and tomorrow. This is a great slide, and you might recognize yourself in it, as one of these professions. And the slide sort of reminds me of how we're all in our own little silos and living in our own little worlds in our industry and what we know, right? And we have innovation and improvement within our industries and our fields, but it's really much in the box, right? Very linear, very predictable. And no doubt that value and success can be created within this box of ours. But I think a really interesting opportunity comes into play when we go outside our box and look for innovation opportunities between disciplines, between professions. And it very much matches this new world that we're living in, where it's not just good enough to innovate within what you know, but to innovate between and into what we do not know. Here are some great ideas that have revolutionized and changed human history. The first one, the world is not flat, but round, Galileo during the Renaissance. We'll sail west to India. That was Christopher Columbus, and nobody knew what was west. Everybody sailed east to India, and he discovered America. And of course, the third one, we should fly like birds. Can you imagine how ludicrous that sounded, during the time of the Wright brothers? People said, if men were meant to fly, we're born with wings, right? And yet, it's something that's really normal to us these days. And, very recently, we should go to Mars, which has happened this year. Maybe just about 30 years ago, it just sounded like an impossibility, crazy, thing that we could not do. So my first message to you in this new world is really to be radical. And we don't normally think of us in Singapore to come up with revolutionary things, right? But here are some interesting innovations that have transformed Singapore. The first one, we sail south to find a good port. Sir Stanford Raffles, right? We would not be here if he did not venture forth to find a new port of call for the British Empire. The second one, imagine a third world little island saying we will build a world-class airline that will be the top 3 in the entire planet, right? This would be 1960s when Singapore had MSA. Anybody knows what MSA is? It was Malaysia Singapore Airlines that existed in the 60s. And when we broke off from Malaysia, we had to build our own airline because we wanted the world to come to Singapore and we wanted Singapore to go to the world. The third one, all computers should create great sound. If, for those of us especially who are like a little bit older, if you remember in the 80s, computers never had sound. It was just this green screen which we looked at and did spreadsheets. And some crazy guy in Singapore, and he was parked out at Sim Lim Tower in a little shop saying that I want to give computers great sound, because he was a musician and he wanted his computer to create great sound. And that was someone who subsequently built Creative Technology, which became a billion-dollar company, which gave great sound to computers all over the world. And who knows what will come next? And really, we sometimes think that we're small and we can't make a difference, but look at the heritage that we have come from. So here's another interesting question. So we all pretty much know how we got here, but why did we get here? And many people know who was responsible for us getting here, right? That's Sir Stamford Raffles. And in many ways, when I was thinking about this, Stamford Raffles was really Singapore's first pioneering and probably most audacious entrepreneur. And what was the story of Raffles before he came to Singapore? There was a big conflict between Dutch and the British in this part of the world to dominate trade routes. And Raffles, a young officer in the East India Company, was told by his bosses, like, we need to beat the Dutch. And we need to find a port, right? And you need to do this or else we're curtains. And so he sailed forth from Penang to find this new port that was going to give the British Empire a competitive advantage. So we all know he ended up in Singapore, and Singapura was the ultimate startup, right? It's this barren, empty, sandy island with a deep harbor offshore, and Raffles looked at it and says, okay, I can see the potential and future in this place. And so how did he create something from literally sand? He had 2 radical ideas. One, free port. All the other ports around the cities and around this region, you had to pay port duties, right, whenever a ship came to port, right? And that was, it's like, okay, if we give it free, I think that would be a great way of enticing people to come to Singapore. And we sometimes think of this internet revolution as radical, right? It's like, wow, the internet is really challenging because suddenly everything is free. But the idea of free is as old as 200 years. The second thing he did was made the port free to all, right? The Dutch ports only allowed Dutch ships to port there, right? British ships, French ships, any other ships were not allowed to port, right? It was a monopoly, exclusive. So in order to make Singapore successful, he came out with this second radical idea: make it open to everyone, regardless of nationality and the flag on your ship. So really, radical openness is the reason why Singapore is here today, and we're all here today because of this fundamental philosophy. So the whole story of Singapore is that we subsequently built our success on free trade, right? Bringing things from China, from the Spice Islands, all the way to markets in Europe. So this was the story for very much of the last 200 years, even to today, and it will continue, right? Because there are always physical things to be shipped. But let me show you another radical map. And this may not look so familiar to you. Anybody has any guesses what this could be? Okay, this is the map of the internet, right? The blue lines that you see here are interconnections between the cities, which are on the outer rim of the circle. Fortunately, you can see the little red dot. That's Singapore plugged into this new map of an interconnected world. So the question that we have here today is, how do we succeed in this new map of the world? What sort of values, what sort of skills do we need? You know, because arguably the most valuable things we're trading now is not so much, you know, in what we make, like this object here, but what we can create in our minds and then ship over literally the internet rather than putting it on a boat. So I have 3 interesting suggestions to you. One is be a sponge. So be open to ideas coming in from everywhere. And we're fortunate because we're connected to the world, you know, with the internet and broadband. Number 2, we need to have a culture where we are sharing ideas, right? We're bringing our ideas closer together, right? We may be, you know, however brilliant or smart as individuals, but we are increasingly seeing how brilliant we are when we bring our ideas together, when we tap on collective intelligence. And third, of course, you know, find ways to share our ideas, to ship our ideas out of Singapore and with the rest of the world. So the interesting thing about it is that while we want our ideas to be spread and to be heard elsewhere, you know, people are actually also looking around for the same thing, right? And they are actually connecting to you, whether in a sense you like it or not. And that's a great, incredible phenomenon that we're living in today. So the second message I have to you is be radically open. You know, I'm really amazed when I compare these maps, which really span 200 years now. You know, the first map was when Raffles landed at the mouth of the Singapore River. You can see almost the exact spot where the picture is illustrating, and the radical difference that it's made over this time. And we often think about the future as, you know, what will the future hold? You know, what will the future be? But really, we're living in an age where the future is in our hands, right? It is up to us as individuals, and it's really in our heads because it's in our, you know, minds and our ideas that can create things. And I'd like to end by sharing this quote from a German physicist, which goes, "Everyone is a genius at least once a year. And the real geniuses simply bring the ideas closer together." And I would like to add to that, and the truly ingenious share and spread the ideas to make them a reality. So carpe diem, and thank you very much.